Death at Gallows Green. Chapter 12. All art is but imitation of nature. Seneca. No great artist ever sees things as they really are. Oscar Wilde. Truth is always strange, stranger than fiction. Lord Byron. Beatrix was delighted that the Hyde Parkers took very little notice of her desire to leave with Qa'Rajh. The carriage ride from Melford Hall to Bishop's Keep took 8 hours all told, including an hour for luncheon at the Polstead Oak Leaf, a dark little inn which offered a greasy kidney pudding and stale Chelsea buns. But there was rhubarb tart and hot elder cordial out of a copper urn, and the fare did not matter in any event. For Beatrix, the journey itself was a notable event, and the company unmeasurably enjoyable. The carriage, driven by Kate's man Pocket, and laden with luggage and Beatrix's animals, fastened up in hampers and cages, wended its way through the countryside. The narrow Essex lanes were bordered by bluebells and banks of blue speedwell, the marshes bloomed with golden kingcups, and the large flowered bitter cress, and the hedges were fragrant with May blossom. As Beatrix and Kate bounced along, their conversation ranged over a universe of subjects, and became intimate even before they reached Great Waldingfield. Beatrix found that Kate, who wore a grey travelling dress and a grey felt hat perched on her mane of russet hair, had a way of listening intently with genuine interest. It was a trait that Beatrix had happened upon very seldom in her life, and despite her shyness she found it so inviting that she surprised herself by revealing some of her most private thoughts. She told Kate more about her wish to publish a children's book, with drawings and a story about her desire to leave Bolton Gardens, and her fear that she would always have to live with her father and her mother. "Although I love them both," she added, "Papa can be quite fidgety about things, while Mamma complains constantly." She sighed, afraid that she was being disrespectful, and began to talk about her wish to have a small stone cottage all of her own, with a front garden full of flowers, which just might be possible, she added. "I was recently given some North Pacific Railway bonds, although they've paid no interest since '93, the company being in the hands of receivers, but there is hope of realizing a small amount for them." And Beatrix listened with great eagerness as the carriage rumbled through the early afternoon haze, and Kate talked about herself, about her father's death before her birth, and her mother's death when she was 5. About growing up in New York City in the family of an Irish aunt and an uncle, a policeman of all things. Beatrix had never known anyone whose uncle was a policeman. About working as a governess for 2 utterly dreadful children, and as a secretary for an elderly German lady, and as an author, until she was asked by her father's older sister to come to England, where, upon her aunt's untimely death, she inherited the Ardley family estate. Really, this American woman was the most fascinating creature, so clever, so much energy, and so much imagination, and so much independence, especially in choosing what she wanted to do. "You're an author?" Beatrix's sigh was wistful. Being an author was the dream that she had cherished the most. If she could only sell her illustrated stories, she might be able to earn an independence something like Kate's. She might remove herself from the hothouse of Bolton Gardens to a little cottage in the north, with ducks and geese and pigs and gardens all around. Kate's mouth compressed. "Perhaps I should not have told you about my work. No one else in England knows." "But why ever not?" Beatrix asked wonderingly. Kate made a self-deprecating face. "Because I write sensational stories, penny dreadfuls, what you call shilling shockers. My last story was called The Conspiracy of the Golden Scarab. I wrote it under the name of Beryl Bardwell." She paused and glanced at Beatrix, as if testing her response. "It was about a murder, you see." "How amazing!" Beatrix murmured. Her life in Bolton Gardens had not been so sheltered that she had never read a shilling shocker. She had, in fact, read any number of sensational tales, for they were in all the popular magazines. Her mother, no doubt, would require the smelling bottle if she thought the purity of her daughter's mind was being tainted with such poisonous stuff. "I should very much like to read it," she added shyly. "You would?" Kate brightened. Then you shall. It was published in America just last month, and I have a copy. But don't let the servants know, or anyone else. I sometimes use the people around me as starting points for my characters, and everyday events seem to have a way of intruding into my plots. They do indeed, Beatrix agreed enthusiastically. I draw what I see, and I do it as realistically as possible. That's why I use living animals and copy mushrooms and flowers from nature. Kate smiled. Where in nature does one find a frog wearing a mackintosh and galoshes? Beatrix returned the smile. Of course, art is always stranger than life. Indeed, Kate said. Real life is remarkably lacking in the sensational. If I were to write what goes on every day at Bishop's Keep, shopping in the village, seeing to the servants, the gardens, the house, I would have no readers. But I must settle down to writing very soon if I am to finish the story my editor has requested. I am hoping for inspiration. She frowned a little. Of course, she said half to herself, there are the Marston Emeralds. I beg your pardon? Beatrix said. Oh, nothing. Kate shook her head, still frowning. Nothing I can do anything about, at any rate, she said, obscurely. Beatrix smiled. Well then, my dear Kate, she said, we shall simply have to have an adventure. Your next story must be a story of real life, and I shall perhaps find a new idea or two and will do better than putting galoshes on a frog. Kate patted her hand. So it's resolved, she said gaily. We shall have an adventure, and it shall be filled with enough murder and theft and missing persons to fill the most sensational of novels. Bee began to feel anxious. Perhaps we'd better wait until we arrive safely at Bishop's Keep, she said. I should rather not be adventured upon. The rest of the journey, however, proved to be without adventure or misadventure of any sort. They arrived at Bishop's Keep just before tea. The house itself, a large grey brick, Georgian, trimmed in white, wasn't as grand as Melford Hall, Beatrix thought, but it was spacious and attractive, and so much lighter and more airy-looking than Bolton Gardens. A pair of stone lions stood guard on either side of the steps that led down to the drive, and the house was surrounded by thick evergreens and hollies. To one side was a veranda bordered by beds of brilliant flowers, with roses twining up the pillars. Below the house, set like a sapphire in the emerald grass of the park, lay a small lake, on the other side of which loomed an ancient rock ruin, like a large grotto, shaded by huge copper beeches. It was, Kate had told her, the ruin of the old Norman keep that had given Bishop's Keep its name. Beatrix smiled happily as she left off admiring the vista and stepped around the carriage to show Pocket which hamper contained Mrs. Tiggywinkle. A few days to herself in this lovely peaceful spot, no mamma constantly complaining at her, no papa telling her what to do, and her new friend Kate with whom to share confidences. This, by itself, was all the adventure she needed. As Kate stepped out of the carriage after Bee, she realized how glad she was to be at home. She had enjoyed Melford Hall, especially after she had met Bee, but there were half a dozen projects on the way at Bishop's Keep, not the least of which were the design of a new conservatory and planting of a new garden behind the house. She was anxious to return to them. And there was her new story to begin, and the business about the Marston Emeralds that she couldn't quite dismiss from her mind. And the other news she had received from Eleanor, that Sir Charles Sheridan had returned to Marston Manor and might soon be... Welcome back, Miss Audley. Kate spun around as if she had conjured him up. There he was, Sir Charles, dismounting from a bay horse. He was a tall, lean man in his mid-30s, with deep-set eyes, regular features, a close-trimmed brown beard, and brown hair curling neatly into his collar. As usual, he wore a shapeless brown felt hat and Norfolk breeches, and a brown canvas jacket whose pockets were lumpy as ever with the gear and tackle of an amateur scientist. He had gained a knighthood by taking some sort of photograph of the Queen at her Jubilee, but the honour seemed to matter very little to him, to the point where he always seemed surprised when he was addressed as Sir Charles, as Kate did now. Sir Charles, she said, trying not to show how pleased she was. How kind of you to call. I was on my way to visit the ruins, he remarked, gathering the reins in his hands, and saw your carriage. I understand you've been at Melford Hall for the week. Yes, Kate said, disappointed. Of course he had not come to call, but merely to continue his study of the bats. Eleanor's remark to the contrary. Sir Charles had no interest in women, and certainly none in her. Science was his mistress. Bee came around the carriage carrying Mrs. Tinkywinkle's wicker hamper, and Kate turned. Sir Charles, I would like you to meet. Miss Potter, Sir Charles exclaimed, his voice deepening with pleasure. Oh, very good to see you. And Mrs. Tinkywinkle, of course. What brings the two of you to this corner of Essex? I thought you never strayed far from Bolton Gardens. Has your father come with you? Kate was struck with surprise, and surprised even more when she looked at Bee, who had flushed nervously. Clearly Sir Charles and Bee were old friends, and judging from Bee's blush, she was very glad to see him. Oh, dear, Bee said, so flustered that she nearly dropped the hamper. Sir Charles, how delightful to see you again. No, Papa has not come with me, I'm afraid. That is, She stopped. He's not ill, I hope. No, quite the contrary. A dimple flashed in Bee's cheek, and her plainness was transformed to something close to prettiness. I fear I've been very naughty, Sir Charles. I took leave of Milford Hall without informing Papa or Mamma. I have not told them that I have come to Bishop's Keep. Should you happen to see them, I beg you not to give me away. Kate looked from Bee to Sir Charles. You have been long acquainted? She asked. Sir Charles nodded. We met through Sir Henry Roscoe, Mrs. Potter's uncle and a chemist of distinction. He showed me her drawings of fungi, including one clump of Pisidia aurantia. Most remarkable, I must say, extraordinarily precise, a very faithful reproduction of nature. He turned back to Bee. And I thank you for the copy of your paper on the propagation of mold spores, Mrs. Potter. I found it quite intriguing. I hope we will have time during your visit to discuss it. Mold spores? Kate asked. Indeed, Bee replied happily, more animated than Kate had ever seen her. I've recently been considering lichens as well, Sir Charles, and I'm anxious to have your views on my theory that they are dual organisms, fungi living in close association with algae. Uncle Henry says I should discuss the matter with Mr. Thistleton Dyer, the director at Kew. Sir Charles nodded. I should certainly like to hear your idea, Mrs. Potter, but in the meantime... His eyebrows drew together and his face became sober. You will no doubt hear the news from your housekeeper, Miss Ardley, but perhaps I should set you right on the matter first, so that you will not be overly distressed when you discover that your maid Amelia and the master and footman Lawrence... Lawrence! Kate exclaimed, remembering Eleanor's suspicion. And Amelia? Could she be involved in some kind of wretched jewel-robbing scheme? I trust you won't make it hard for the girl. She and Lawrence meant no great mischief. I think, Sir Charles, Kate said grimly, that you had better tell me exactly what they were up to. An apologetic look crossed his face. I'm afraid, he said, that they discovered a dead man. Bee gasped. A dead man? Kate exclaimed, forgetting all about the emeralds. Yes, Sir Charles said soberly, and told them. Oh, how appalling, Kate cried, clasping her hands. Poor Agnes Oliver. You know the widow, then? Sir Charles asked. I do, Kate said. I met her at St. Mary's Church. She has helped me carry on Aunt Sabrina's work. Kate was Irish and had grown up in an Irish family, but she had given up attending Mass years before. Under the gentle influence of Vicar Talbot, the Episcopal vicar in the nearby village of Dedham, she had continued her aunt's practice of giving generously to the support of needy people in the surrounding villages and hamlets. I must call on Agnes tomorrow, she said. How very dreadful. And whatever will the poor woman do to earn a living? Well, she is to be given a police pension, I understand, Sir Charles said. £15 a year, and 2 and 10 for the child. This Sergeant Oliver, Bee said tremulously. This friend of yours. You said he was murdered, Sir Charles. I'm afraid so, Sir Charles said. The coroner's inquest was held yesterday. The jury returned a verdict of homicide. Does Constable Lakin yet have an idea why the sergeant was killed? Kate asked. The death of the constable and the loss of the jewels seemed to her unusually coincidental. Perhaps they were connected. If so, the constable would soon discover it. She pulled herself up short. No, he wouldn't, for he couldn't know that Lady Marston's emeralds were missing. No one but she, and Eleanor, and perhaps the thief, knew that. She would send a message to Eleanor immediately and let her know what had happened. Lady Marston must be told about the theft, and the constable informed. The business was very possibly connected to the murder. Lakin has been taken off the case, and the investigation has been handed over to some bureaucrat in Colchester, Sir Charles said. Some ridiculous political thing, no doubt. Ned's terribly upset by it, of course, for he was Oliver's friend, but his hands are tied in the matter. I don't suppose, Kate remarked, thinking that Lady Marston might find it easier to talk to Sir Charles about the missing emeralds than to the constable, that your hands are tied. A smile flickered briefly across Sir Charles' face. "You're right," he said. "I intend to find out who killed Arthur Oliver." He went back to his horse and stepped into the saddle, and Kate thought that his eyes seemed to linger on her. "I'm sorry to have been the bearer of bad news, Miss Ardley, so shortly upon your arrival." He shifted his glance to Bea with a smile. "I won't forget those lichens, Miss Potter. We must talk soon." As she said goodbye to Sir Charles, Kate was thinking about Agnes Oliver and her daughter Betsy, and whether they needed help. And Beryl Bardwell, the irrepressible Beryl whose imagination was fired by even the slightest of mysteries, was deeply intrigued. Why had Sergeant Oliver been killed? What did his murder have to do with the theft of the emeralds? Was Lawrence involved with either or both? And what of Amelia? As Kate turned to go up the stairs to Bishop's Keep, her mouth firmed. She had work to do, and she knew exactly where to start.